Okey-dokey. Why isn't the camera? Good Monday evening, everybody. Not sure why my camera's not working. But you can hear me anyhow. Hope everybody had a good weekend. We had a great weekend. We had a busy weekend. We had a whole bunch of the grandkids over. We had our kids over. Had our grandson over for an overnight. So it was a very, very busy weekend. Spring, I think, is coming. See if I can fix the camera here, guys. Just a second. I probably can. This is beyond my technical ability. Good evening, everyone. Anyway, it was a good day today. I ended up doing a live stream with Destiny. Some of you might be here tonight having heard me on Destiny at 4 o'clock Eastern. If you're new to the site, welcome. My name is Phil Gurski. I'm a former strategic analyst with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And I talk a lot about terrorism and public safety and national security on this program. I'd like you to subscribe to this channel and to like us as well. So, yeah, I'm curious if anybody is joining us tonight from the Destiny podcast. If it is your first time, welcome. I think you're going to like it. I want to talk about a lot of things tonight, but I want to start off by reading you something I came across in, of all places, the Canadian Legion magazine, which I subscribe to. And this is an article that came out in the you can't see the camera, March-April edition of 2021. And it is a story about a Nazi named Roland Freisler, who was the president of the People's Court in August of 1942. He had argued before the war, quote, "Anybody committing a crime against the state should be considered a terrorist and classed as subhuman with no legal protections." He went on to actually judge the case of a young girl called Sophie Scholl, who was part of what was called the White Rose Group, which was an anti-Hitler group in Germany during the Second World War. He found her guilty, and he had her guillotined in 1943. The reason why I want to bring this up is this notion of the use of the term terrorist. The fact that the German judge could essentially label someone a terrorist just because they are against the Nazi regime. Now, where we've heard that before in recent days? I think I've done already some broadcasts on this. The Turkish President Erdogan has talked about people who oppose his government as being terrorists. Vladimir Putin calls anybody opposing him to be terrorists. The Chinese government says anybody that doesn't like their policies in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang province, are terrorists. So the word goes back a long way, guys. Anyone who doesn't like what you're doing basically labels you a terrorist. Picking up Scotch Agas, can you at some point do a video on the history of terrorism? That would be a very, very long video, my friend. And we could do this in parts. That's a really good idea, actually. I'll take you up on that. And we'll see how far down the road we get. So for tonight's episode, I want to return to something that I've kind of been talking a little bit about, but there's a couple things that happened recently that have brought it to my attention again. And this notion is, how long do terrorist groups survive and under what conditions? So the reason why I wanted to bring this up is I came across a couple of stories on the weekend in the Nigerian press. The first one was a statement by the Lieutenant General of the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Atihiru, who said on Sunday, he told Nigerians that Boko Haram, which is a terrorist group which has been around for a better part of 15 years now in Nigeria, will soon be history. He's going to be an end vowed during a Christmas Day speech, Boko Haram. And yet they remain probably the second or third most lethal terrorist group in the world. Interestingly, the same day that the left put out his statement, another Nigerian paper reported that the army is saying nothing as Boko Haram had killed 69 soldiers in Borno State, which is a state in northeastern Nigeria where Boko Haram has a stronghold. So the general says their history, Boko Haram kills 69 people in 3 days. And another article in a third African source called New African says that Africa is now in the eye of global terrorism. In fact, it is now that 7 of the 10 highest risk countries for terrorism are in Africa. Not the Middle East, not South Asia, not Southeast Asia, but Africa. So really interesting that we've got this notion somehow that a terrorist group is on its last legs. And yet Boko Haram is doing nothing to obey the Lieutenant General's words or the Nigerian president's speeches over the years. And in fact, seems to be getting worse and worse with time. And the interesting part about Nigeria is that it is also home to Islamic State West African province. And as most Islamic State affiliates, they're pretty brutal. They're very active in northeastern Nigeria as well. So the situation in Nigeria is not getting any better. But I want to turn to the main topic tonight. As I when I promoted this live stream, I said I want to talk about Irish terrorism. And the reason why I want to do that is I came across 2 really interesting pieces again on the weekend. I don't take the weekends off, guys. I keep reading on the weekend. The first one was an article in a website I get sent to me all the time. It's called warisboring.com. It's a really interesting site, actually. And the title of this particular article was Irish Americans Invaded Canada in a Plot to Liberate Ireland. This is a reference to the Battle of Ridgeway on June the 2nd, 1866. Now, Ridgeway is a small town in the Niagara Peninsula, kind of just south of St. Catharines, just outside of Fort Erie, very close to the U.S. border. And in the 1860s, Americans of Irish descent felt that if they attacked Canada, they would put pressure on the British government to grant Ireland independence. And I got to read you this thing. This was a boast that the Irish, they're called the Fenians, and you can read about the Fenians and about Irish terrorism in Canada in my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. It's available on my website at borealisthreatandrisk.com. But here's the song that they sang in the pubs in Boston and various parts of the United States in the 1860s. We are the Fenian Brotherhood, skilled in the arts of war, and we're going to fight for Ireland, the land that we adore. Many battles we have won, along with the boys in blue, and we'll go and capture Canada, for we've nothing else to do. I just thought that was a really cool song by the Fenians. The reference to the boys in blue is that many Irish Americans fought in the Civil War. They fought for the North against the South. Anyhow, that was the 1860s. And for those of you who've read my book, you know that the very first act of terrorism in Canadian history occurred in 1868. So not even a year into Canada's birth, when Thomas D'Arcy McGee was assassinated by Patrick James Whalen, who was a Fenian terrorist. And I see Bill's chiming in with rest in peace, Thomas D'Arcy McGee. He was an important figure in Canada's independence from Great Britain in 1867. And he was shot about a few meters, well, maybe a few tens of meters from Parliament Hill on Spark Street in downtown Ottawa by Mr. Whalen, who was found out to be a Fenian terrorist. So our country hadn't even celebrated its first birthday, and it had its first terrorist attack. Now, why am I picking up on this? Well, I got an interesting message on LinkedIn by a contact of mine called Lorcan Owens. He's in the Republic of Ireland. He's Irish. And he says that he sent me something from another Irish contact named Ian Tennyson. And Mr. Tennyson writes, more sinister posters appeared in Banbridge yesterday. Those responsible further no political aim, but to intimidate residents and sow division. The overt threat of violence is disgusting, totally unacceptable, and must be condemned by all. What was the poster? Well, the poster that Ian posted was a picture of a guy in a black mask holding a pistol and says, our forefathers fought for our freedom and rights. No border in the sea, or we continue the fight. Now, I had no idea what this was all about, so I asked Lorcan about, what's this poster all about? And he says it has to do with Brexit. So, for those who are following Brexit, of course, under Boris Johnson, England decided to leave the European Union, which means that they're out of the free trade area, they're out of the customs union, and they essentially have gone completely independent from the EU. Now, Northern Ireland, apparently, with of course the 6 counties that still belong to England, did not vote in favor of Brexit. They wanted to remain a part of the European Union. And what this poster seems to be suggesting is that if the European Union plays hardball with England, they will actually create a customs barrier, meaning that goods cannot travel customs free between the EU and Northern Ireland. Which means there's going to be, as the poster says, a barrier, a wall in the Irish Sea. And these guys that post these posters seem to be threatening violence if the customs union, in fact, is undermined by the British Brexit vote, which is really, really odd if you think about it. What this pointed out to me is very, very simple. Yes, I do have some interesting contacts. Don't get me started. I've got fascinating people all over the world. What it suggests to me is that the juxtaposition of these two stories. So the Battle of Ridgeway in 1866 and threats of violence by people in Northern Ireland over Brexit in 2021 means that violence, terrorist violence, because the guy on the poster is clearly a terrorist. He's wearing a black mask and holding a pistol and threatening violence. That this particular area of the world has been beset by terrorist violence for over almost 160 years. 160 years. So the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was various forms of it have been around since the late 19th century, but it is more or less believed to have taken shape around 1915, just prior to the Irish War of Independence, when Ireland finally gained its independence in 1921, and then was very active in various ways all throughout the 20th century until, of course, 1969, when the Troubles began between the Republic and the North. And I'm sure you've all read stories about the IRA and the deaths and the destruction over a 30-year period before the Good Friday Accords of 1998. So again, why am I focusing on this? I'm focusing on this for a very simple reason, is that terrorism, at least this particular form of terrorism, which surrounds the independence of Ireland, which of course is its own republic. Ireland is still part of the EU. It's a member of the EU. It's a completely independent state. But the status of the 6 counties in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, has never been resolved to the satisfaction of the rest of the people in the Republic. Which means that, yes, there is still an IRA around. They call themselves the real IRA to differentiate themselves with those that basically caved into the Good Friday Accords. What this means is that there are definitely elements within the Republic who would still look at the possibility of turning to terrorism to get their way, to resolve their grievance. And their grievance is the return of the 6 counties to the Republic of Ireland. So that the Emerald Isle is one contiguous independent state, and that Northern Ireland would no longer be a vassal of England, of Great Britain. At the same token, you've got people in Northern Ireland who probably would stop at nothing at using violence to retain their status as part of Great Britain. So if pressure were brought to join the Republic, so join the South into a unitary state, there are probably those who would actually fight. And this poster is kind of silly because, I can't see people becoming terrorists over a trade agreement or over a treaty to leave the European Union. But what it points out is that people who are wedded to a cause, and this cause has been going on, this is actually, the terrorist part of this cause has been going on for 160 years. The Irish-English conflict has been going on for the better part of a millennium. Okay, when England finally conquered Ireland, was it in the 1300s or whatever it was when they finally took over? This is a long-standing dispute, and there's been violence on both sides. So JB says there are constantly talks of the Good Friday Agreement following Brexit and UK negotiations with Europe. Any chances this ends up with violence and terrorism? Absolutely. Because there will always be those who are simply unhappy with what happens in the Republic of Ireland and what happens in Northern Ireland. So to go back to the Nigerian Lieutenant General's comment, how could anybody talk about this group, the IRA and all of its affiliates and all of its hangers-on, as being completely defeated, when in actual fact, the grievances have not been resolved? I mean, I'm not trying to flog a dead horse here, guys, but I just find this really fascinating that no one talks anymore about the IRA. No one talks about violence in Ireland in the same way they did in the late 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and even in the 2000s. I mean, the IRA was carrying out regular attacks in England in the 1980s and 1990s. They almost killed Margaret Thatcher in Brighton in the early 80s. And there's every possibility. I'm not being predictive here. I'm not trying to say it's a probability, but there's every possibility that in fact you could see a return to violence in Ireland, either in the North or in the Republic, or possibly in England itself, by those trying to use violence to force their ways. If you're just joining us tonight, welcome. My name is Phil Gurski. I am a former strategic analyst with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the author of 6 books on terrorism. You're listening to Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight, which is a wide discussion on all things national security and terrorism related. If you're here for the first time, I'd love for you to subscribe. I'd like to like this channel as well. We have a lot of fun on this channel. We talk about a lot of things. It's a very, very dynamic discussion. So Bill says the Nigerian situation reminds you of Bush Jr.'s mission accomplished speech on the aircraft carrier. You're right, Bill. I remember when he did that. I believe it was in early 2004, if memory serves me correct, when George W. Bush decided that the Iraq invasion was completed, mission accomplished. And of course, couldn't be any further from the truth. Yes, Saddam Hussein's army disappeared in a heartbeat, and yet Iraq is basically a very, very unstable, unsafe, violent place to this day. I'm also reminded of Donald Trump when he declared that ISIS had been totally defeated in 2019. This is just after the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the caliph, of the so-called caliph of ISIS. And yet, again, if you look at the news in Iraq and Syria on a daily basis, Islamic State is carrying out attacks, as well as the affiliates in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Syria and Iraq itself. So again, declaring victory prematurely is rarely a good idea. And people keep doing it time and time and time again. So honest critique in India says absence of violence always does not mean victory or peace. You're absolutely right. Now, it'd be interesting to see going forward what happens in Northern Ireland with this dispute over this customs union. And if people start seeing their goods cost more because of Britain's withdrawal from the EU, despite Northern Ireland wanting to stay, England did enter into an agreement with the EU to postpone any kind of change in tax laws and trade laws, I believe, for a period of time. Not sure where that stands right now, but I just find it quite interesting that something as mundane and frankly boring. Have you guys ever read about trade law? I mean, I've been reading The Economist since, the early 1980s, and I struggle reading the finance and economics section because it's written in Lower Slavovian as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand the language. So it's not the most riveting of reading at the best of times. And here we have a bunch of guys in Northern Ireland putting up posters threatening violence over the resurrection of trade barriers. I can't tell you the last time I heard of a terrorist movement that would threaten acts of violence over something as, I don't know, uninteresting as trade, or uninteresting as the price of goods. It'd be really interesting to watch. I would think that they would certainly not hesitate to go after people in the South if the IRA or other groups relaunches its campaign of violence in the North. But trade laws, a barrier in the Irish Sea? Wow, that's a new one on me. Ijaz says, if grievances of the organization, religiously bound or otherwise, are unresolvable in the current political environment, integration is impossible and the threat persists. You're absolutely right, Ijaz. And this is why we've got to, what's the word I want here? We have to be really careful when we think we're wrapping up this thing and putting a bow on it and saying that it's done. because it simply doesn't work that way. Yes, there are terrorist movements and terrorists who will either put down their weapons, at least temporarily, depending on what kind of deal they get, whether it's an amnesty, whether they feel they can, present what's been offered as a victory of sorts. But it is not certain in any way that those who do not see a complete victory and a complete winning of everything that they want, I just can't see those people downing their weapons in perpetuity. They can always get back. JB says, or as the grievances are unachievable, if the requests of religious nature, then there is no end in sight. Yeah. Religious terrorism is such that only one side can win. If you're convinced that your God is right and the other God is wrong, that there is no resolution. There's no way you can agree to disagree on this and both go your separate ways. It's all or nothing. One person, one group has to walk away with all the spoils. There's no compromise. There's no middle ground, because you're simply unwilling to acknowledge that what you're gaining or what you're hoping to gain, which is tied to some belief in a deity, some kind of religiously mandated things, that you're going to accept anything less than exactly what you want. Bill says, yes, there are religious undertones, of course, to the former troubles in Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is largely Catholic. The North is largely Protestant, based on the fact that it remained part of Britain. I always wondered about that, Bill, about how important was the Catholic versus Protestant battle in Ireland over the decades. It was certainly presented as that, I think, for a lot of people, but I would say this was more a political grievance rather than a religious one. Whereas for things like Islamic State and Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, this is really a religious debate, which has some political aspects. So I guess the way I would put it, Bill, is that the Irish troubles, the Irish conflict was 98% political and 2% religious, whereas what Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and all the Taliban do is 98% religious and 2% political. So Ijaz says, this raises an interesting question on the purpose of counterterrorism or CVE. Join the club, Ijaz. I've been saying that for decades. And it's not that I reject the usefulness is the wrong word. I don't reject the practice of CVE and counterterrorism because it might work. But as somebody who worked in counterterrorism for as long as I did, I'm rather skeptical when people say that they've drunk the Kool-Aid and no longer believe in something. So I don't want to say once a terrorist, always a terrorist, but you've got to be very, very cautious in declaring, that these things are over. So as Ijaz says, whether the goal of counterterrorism actors is to address the grievances, underline the threat, combat ideological propaganda, military defeat, or all of the above. When you work in counterterrorism, you don't do CVE. Counterterrorism is very simple. You're trying to stop things from blowing up. You're trying to stop people from killing people. Countering violent extremism, that's not really a job for your security services and your law enforcement. They're just there to basically stop crimes from happening. CVE is more of a civil society thing, whether it's religious groups or other parts of government. When I was with Public Safety Canada, I did some CVE, and one of the things we realized is it's really tough to measure effectiveness. You don't know if what you're doing is working. It's not a bad idea to try it, but at the end of the day, you went home, you thought, did I make any difference tonight? Did anyone listen? Did I change anyone's mind? Honest critique reminds us that daylight savings time is started in Canada, so it's 5:30 a.m. in India. Guys, you are the most committed people to the live stream I know about. If it's 5:30 a.m. and so you got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to listen, wow, you guys deserve the most dedicated people on the Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight live stream. I'm sorry that I don't get that doesn't come with any cash, but it comes with my extreme appreciation and a hero biscuit to you all for doing this. Yeah, exactly, Jazz. That's commitment. Yeah, Jazz did point out that I started at 8 o'clock and there was still a tiny bit of light outside, which for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere who've just survived 5 months of winter, when daylight savings time hits in March, it's like a godsend. It's like, oh my God, the end is in sight. It doesn't get dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's there's actually signs that spring is here. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight. My name is Phil Gurski. I'm a former analyst with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the author of 5 books on terrorism, including the most recent, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada, Confederation of the Present. I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. I'd also like you to like it if you could. And also go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com. You'll find all kinds of material there, blogs, podcasts, reviews of Marvel movies. You'll also find the top 10 worst terrorist groups in history, as well as the top 10 worst right-wing extremist groups. We like to have fun on this as well. And hey, Yusuf, welcome back. So JB says he wants to correct me here that it was a very modest winter in Quebec. Get lost, JB. For the longest time, I had 2.5 meters of snow on my front lawn, so I don't want to hear about you guys in Trois-Rivières not having much snow. It's you're just rubbing it in right now, so you can go away. So Bill says there's lots of snow in Newfoundland. Bill, I love Newfoundland like a brother, but if you send me snow from Newfoundland, you're no longer my friend. So just keep it on the rock, please. You guys can deal with it. Besides, you're on the rock. You guys are used to lousy weather. It's cold, it's windy, it's rainy. That's what makes a Newfoundlander, isn't it? I'm not going to worry about you guys shipping snow out here. Anybody also, aside from the weather and aside from daylight savings time, anybody else want to chime in on the topic of how to defeat terrorist groups, or rather, how do terrorist groups decide to give up the ghost? Yusuf says it's 12 degrees in Vancouver. Get lost, Yusuf. Nobody cares. You guys on the West Coast are always bragging about the lack of winter, lack of snow. You're growing daffodils in February. Yeah, we get it. We get it. Make the rest of Canada feel bad. All right. Anything else, guys, about what's happening in the terrorism front? Or should we just talk about the weather again? It's supposed to be 10 degrees here in Russell on Wednesday, I believe. Aaron asked, do you think the PIRA, the Provisional IRA, would target a soft target again? Great question. Soft targets are really, really problematic. If you're a terrorist group, one of the things that you rely on, is some kind of a base of support. And if you do things that kill a bunch of innocent people, or you take out targets that many would say are not justifiable targets, you can actually lose an awful lot of support. And when you do that, you run the risk that people are going to start calling you out or cooperating with authorities to find you and neutralize your effectiveness to prevent you from carrying out more acts of violence. Sometimes mistakes are made. Sometimes people are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Anybody see, there was a great movie a couple years ago with Helen Mirren called Eye in the Sky. That was a movie about drones and airstrikes in Somalia. And there's this scene where they've got this terrorist group negotiating, or rather a terrorist group planning a suicide bomb. And they've got drones, and they've got these little tiny drones with cameras, and they've got the guys all set up, and they wait until the area is completely clear, and they're going to launch an airstrike. And at the last minute, a little girl comes into the scene, and they try to get someone on the ground. They got a human source on the ground to get her out, but they don't get her. They don't get her out in time, and she dies. And not only is there's angst amongst the team that launched the drone, launched the missile strike, but there's this notion that they've created more enemies than they've saved. They've worsened the situation because this little girl was killed in an airstrike that was intended to take out nothing but terrorists. So that's the problem, Aaron, with soft targets, is that it's really hard to justify. And just saying my bad afterwards doesn't cut it for a lot of people. Honest Critique says, if we could force a group to join the mainstream politics, well, that's kind of what happened with the African National Congress, right? In South America, in South Africa, they were labeled a terrorist group for the longest time. They became the government, and all of a sudden, no one looks at them as a terrorist group anymore. By the way, you're going to see in the next little while, I'm doing a speaking of Marvel movies, I'm going to do a critique review of Black Panther, which I watched recently. And it has some really interesting things to say about terrorism. You may not have looked upon Black Panther as a movie about terrorism, and it's not a movie about terrorism, but there's some interesting scenes in the movie that really speak volumes about terrorism as a tactic. So I'm not going to spoil the ending anymore by that. Just subscribe to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, and you're going to see a review of Black Panther soon, in which it makes you wonder. Makes you wonder about the choices that people make and the willingness to use violence for political ends. I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to say anything more. Anybody else want to chime in on terrorism and how it ends tonight? Before we sign off for the night. Just a reminder, we're on a new schedule now. We're going to do Mondays and Thursdays. And for those of you who liked the former Friday night Ask Phil night, well, Thursday, the second half of Thursday is going to be Ask Phil. So we're going to talk about another theme on Thursday, which I haven't decided what it is yet. But we're going to open the floor for as many questions as you want on Thursday as well, rather than Friday. That way you have your Friday nights free. I can say you could go to the movies, but the theaters are probably still closed. You can go to restaurants, I suppose, depending on where you are in the world. But so we're going to have the Ask Phil on Thursdays as well. So Bill said he watched The Mauritanian the other night. Incredible movie regarding the detainees in Guantanamo. I haven't seen that, Bill. That sounds like a recommendation to me. I'm fascinated by the American decision to use that base in Cuba. It's Guantanamo is kind of like Gibraltar. It's one of these bizarre colonial vestiges of an earlier time. Gibraltar, of course, was conquered by the English in what is it, the 18th century, I believe, and is still in British hands. I was just reading an article recently about Spain keeps wanting England to let go, and England says piss off. They're going to keep Gibraltar. Americans do the same thing. Guantanamo. I mean, Guantanamo is part of Cuba, and the Americans took it, I believe, in the Spanish-American War of the late 19th century. If memory serves me correct. So it's this anachronism. It belongs to an earlier time, and yet that, of course, is where they housed many of the terrorists that they captured on the battlefield in Afghanistan, including some Canadians. So I'll have to check that out, Bill. You say it's an interesting movie. I bet it was. So Honest Critique says, a lot of times we hear that we crack down on their resources like money and freezing other assets. Does that help contain a group? Again, depending on whether money and assets are important. For a lot of groups, they're not important because the groups they're self-sufficient. They don't need money and assets to plan acts of terrorism because terrorism is really, really cheap. So as the Jazz says, very difficult task, I assume. One prominent feature of modern Islamist extremist orgs is an explicit rejection of liberal democracy and existing political structures. Absolutely, Jazz. We saw that in the trial of Shihab Esagayr at Rajazar in Toronto a couple of years ago, where Shihab Esagayr refused to participate in the court's proceedings because he said to the judge, I don't recognize you as here. I don't recognize your authority. I don't recognize your ability to try me. And he demanded that he be tried based on the Quran and Islamic law. And the judge said, piss off. And they actually had to appoint him a lawyer because he refused to accept to get his own lawyer because he refused to recognize the actual veracity and the authority of the court. So you're absolutely right. So you talk about Hizb ut-Tahrir and al-Mujahideen in the United Kingdom, who encourage followers, other Muslims, to not engage in political processes. If your objective is to overthrow existing political structures, integration is impossible. Absolutely. That's exactly what al-Mujahideen do. Absolutely. They basically say that obeying any English law or any English practice is haram. It's forbidden under Islam, which of course it is not, but this is what these groups think. Bill says, regarding the money, I would argue, yes, money is the lifeblood of planning their operations. Yes and no, Bill, again, depending on the size. I mean, certainly the cases that I worked on here in Canada didn't really require any money. But I think for larger terrorist groups, yes, cutting off the money flow is probably an effective way. The problem is that if you cut off one flow, another flow can start. And if they're getting their support from within the community, then that's really, really hard to cut off. Yes, they need money for logistics, training, food, etc. And if you're planning operations on a global scale, then doing that is probably effective. But again, I would put out there, when was the last time that we actually effectively cut off all the flow of money? Hezbollah has been raising money in Canada for decades. The LTTE raised money in Canada for decades. ISIS raised money through the sale of antiquities and the oil market and drugs and everything else in Iraq and Syria under its caliphate. Was that stuff taken away? And if it was, Islamic State is still around. Yusuf says, would the status of power slowly transitioning to the Taliban in Afghanistan be first of its kind when it comes to terrorist organizations negotiating with the government? Not really. Again, the ANC certainly was part of the so-called peace process in South Africa. I don't think the Taliban taking over is a good move for Afghanistan. I think it'll return to the Afghanistan of the 1990s. I think the Taliban are lying through their teeth when they say they won't allow foreign terrorist groups to operate on Afghan soil once they take over. I'm curious what you think, Bill, having been in Afghanistan and having seen it firsthand. What are the chances that the Taliban, if they do take over, which they will, if all foreign troops leave Afghanistan, what are the chances that the Taliban are going to be any different now than they were in the 1990s? I don't know. I don't see this being a pleasant ending for Afghanistan or the Afghan people. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight. My name is Phil Gurski. I'm a former strategic analyst with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I'm also the author of 6 books on terrorism, including the most recent, The Peaceable Kingdom. I'd like you to subscribe to this channel and like it on YouTube as well. Go to my website, borealisthreatandrisk.com. You'll find all the blogs and podcasts, a link to how to buy the new book, lots of information and material there. I'd like you to become part of our team. We talk about a lot of interesting things, and there's a lot of really good back and forth on terrorism and all things national security. Bill agrees that if the Taliban come back in power, that this is not a good thing. Exactly. Does laying down sanctions on a group? You know what? This is from Honest Critique in India. I don't really know if sanctions ever really work. I know the U.S. government loves to put sanctions on, leading Russian officials and leading Iranian officials, and sometimes it prevents them from traveling from A to B. But do sanctions ever really make a difference? Now, I'm not an economist, so I want to be very careful here. This is not my specialty, but I have this sneaking suspicion that sanctions are really, really easy to put in place, but really hard to measure the actual effectiveness of. It doesn't take a lot of effort to put on sanctions. It's almost kind of like a no-brainer. So Bill says that sanctions put a spoke in the wheels. They can slow groups down. Oh, that's an interesting take on that, Bill. So yes, it could have an effect on them, but does it have enough of an effect to make them stop doing things or to make them change their behaviors, which I guess at the end of the day is what you want, right? You want these groups to stop doing what they're doing. And if sanctions can help that, I guess it's not a bad thing. Ijaz asks, any thoughts on the shift away from Qatar as the base for stalled peace talks? Oh, I didn't know that they had moved from Doha. That's interesting. That he says that the Qataris did not place enough pressure on the Taliban to mitigate violence. The plans are now for Moscow and Turkey to host the talks? That must be late-breaking news, Ijaz. I hadn't heard that they're moving out of Qatar. I would also point out, the Qataris have really pissed off the Saudis, right? And I smell a Saudi rat here, to be perfectly honest. The Saudis have been trying to isolate Qatar for the better part of 2-3 years now. So is it really that the Qataris weren't putting pressure on the Taliban and Moscow? So hang on now. Let me get this straight, guys. So we're going to shift the Afghan peace talks from Qatar, which is more or less neutral-ish in the Persian Gulf, and we're going to shift them to Moscow. Now, would that be the same Moscow that invaded Afghanistan in 1979, which led to the creation of Al-Qaeda, and then after that, the destruction of Afghanistan, which led to the Taliban taking power in 1994? And now Moscow is going to host the talks? Really? Oh, how interesting. And Turkey? Would this be the same Turkey led by Tayyip Recep Erdogan, who is a Turkish nationalist who wants to recreate parts of the Ottoman Empire in the 21st century? So we're going to have the talks there as well? I don't know, guys. If you're going to have talks in a neutral place, pick Fiji. I don't know. Pick Switzerland. Pick Sweden. Why in God's name would you pick Moscow and Turkey? Neither of those countries is at all neutral on most things. Yeah, I agree with Yusuf. The irony of the talks being held in Moscow, that just makes me kind of smile, and not in a good way. The fact that Russia would even offer to do this. Are they trying to make up for having screwed up 42 years ago with the invasion on Christmas Day in 1979? Is Russia a reliable partner on anything? The fact that they're trying to kill Navalny, they're arresting people, charging with terrorism. Bill says Moscow will instruct the Taliban on how to properly annex a region without any real effort. Sorry, that was your outside voice. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the Taliban could probably learn a little bit from the Russians on how to do that. That's a good point, Bill. Anyhow, my understanding is that these peace talks are going nowhere in Doha between the Taliban, the Americans, and the Afghan government. The Afghan government, it seems to be floundering at best these days. Again, if you follow me on Twitter at Borealis Saves, you'll notice that I'm tweeting out at least one, if not two or three terrorist attacks a day in Afghanistan, most of which are carried out by the Taliban, even if they're not claimed, although some are carried out by an Islamic State affiliate called the Islamic State in Khorasan, which is in kind of Nangarhar province in the east. So I feel for the Afghan people. I know many Afghan Canadians. I can't see and I said this before, I just can't see a good ending for the Afghan people coming out of these peace talks. So Honest Critique in India says, did NATO forces benefit the most from the deal anyways? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Part of the peace talks, which the Americans launched, I think in 2017 or 2018, was tied to Donald Trump's desire to get the hell out of Afghanistan. The Americans have been there since October 2001 in the wake of 9/11, and it had become the forever war. I mean, Bill, you were there. You know what this is all about. And Trump wanted out. He didn't like how much it was costing, didn't like the effect of the American reputation, didn't like the fact that Americans were dying, although not many in recent years as opposed to earlier years. And so in essence, if true peace were to break out, then yes, the other forces under ISAF and NATO could come home. So I guess they would benefit, but the peace talks are not working out well, and the end is not going to be good. Bill said, okay, sorry. Honest Critique says there have been fewer or no attacks on NATO forces since the deal. I didn't realize that. Well, they're concentrating their attacks on Afghan civilians or Afghan national forces, as you say in India, or the Afghan police. Again, every day there are IEDs, there are suicide bombs, there are magnetic mines that they're using now. They're clamping mines to the underside of vehicles, and police forces and soldiers are the ones being killed on a daily basis in Afghanistan. And maybe the reason for that is the Taliban realizes that these are the ones that it has to essentially defeat. When if a peace deal is ever signed and all the foreign forces eventually leave and the Taliban take over, they have to minimize the effects of the security forces, be they law enforcement or the Afghan National Army. Anyhow, not a good end in sight, guys, I think, for Afghanistan. I'm sorry to have to report that. Any last comments, guys, before we wrap up for tonight? This has been a very active session. I want to thank everybody for being here. There have been some great comments. Bill says, as soon as NATO forces leave, the gloves will be off and the Taliban will wage an all-out attack on the Afghan government and its people. Absolutely, Bill. I'm afraid to agree with you, as much as it pains me in terms of the effect on the Afghan people. But you're right. And then the question becomes, what happens if 4 or 5 years from now, a major attack of terrorism is tied back to Afghanistan, be it the Taliban or other foreign terrorist groups that they allowed to thrive on its soil? Do we go back in again? Again, they don't call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires for nothing. Go way back to Alexander the Great's days. So, I'm thinking of you, Bill, as somebody, who went there as part of the RCMP delegation to Afghanistan in the early 2010s to try and make a difference by training Afghan forces and, helping them in any way possible. And to look back a decade later now and say, what really changed? As much as, their progress was made and friendships were formed and a difference was achieved, you must be thinking, wow, what was it all about? what was it all for? It's sad, guys. But war is sad. And war is dumb. And you'd think that as a species, we would have learned that over the past 10,000 years, but apparently we haven't. So I want to end, guys, with the usual words of wisdom. This night is from Nancy Drew's Guide to Life. War, what is it good for? Isn't that a song, JB, in the 1960s? Yeah, you're too young to remember that. I remember that when that was live. That's how old I am. So Bill says the worst fears of the Afghan people are coming to fruition with the exit of NATO from the country. I came across this piece of Yusuf. I came across a piece of news. I'm not sure if it's appropriate for today's live stream. What are your thoughts about Israel relations with Bangladesh? Can we keep that one, Yusuf, for Thursday? We can open with that. I want to talk a little bit about maybe Israel's. This actually, Yusuf, thank you for raising this question. This is a really, really good topic for Thursday. We're going to lead with this. Many African and Middle Eastern countries have recently signed deals, basically established diplomatic relations with Israel. And what I want to talk about is that what effect does that have, if any, on first Palestinian statehood and terrorism in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? So great point, Yusuf. We're gonna lead off with that on Thursday before we go into the open forum of Ask Phil. So again, I'm going to leave you guys tonight with a Nancy Drew bit of wisdom. Comes from The Secret of the Forgotten City. Interesting title. Always lock your car doors. Even if there's nothing in the vehicle to take, a devilish person can always put something harmful into your car. I don't know about you guys. I always lock my car doors whenever I'm going somewhere because I don't want devilish people to put things in. I'm not sure exactly what that kind of thing would be, but hopefully not a magnetic mine here in Russell, Ontario. But thanks to all for coming out tonight. Again, if it's your first time, you can subscribe to this channel, Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight. We come live on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And on Thursday, we're going to have a session, as I mentioned, on Israel and Palestine, followed by an open forum. Thanks, Bill, for the feedback. Oh yeah. So JB raises, this is the last point. I got to let you guys go at some point. I got to let the guys in India have breakfast. A week ago, I mentioned that we wanted to get as far away as possible from 666 subscribers on the channel because, of course, 666 is the number of the beast in biblical, I guess, the New Testament. And as of today, I'm looking up on the website, we now have 866 subscribers to the channel. So we have gained 200 subscribers in a week. That's pretty sweet. I think a lot of them actually may have come from my talk with Destiny. Stephen Bennell, we had a great chat at this afternoon on all things terrorism, on my new book. And it was actually quite fascinating. But thanks to all. Thanks, Honest Critique, for your feedback. This is great, guys. I appreciate you being here, taking the time. I appreciate your questions and your comments. I want to wish you all a very pleasant rest of your evening. For my friends in Mumbai and the rest of India, guys, you have a great day in India, and we'll talk to you all again on Thursday. Thanks again, guys. Much appreciated.